Welcome, this is a new video for you on production possibility frontier analysis. This is the third in a sequence. This time we're going to be looking at how production possibility frontiers can be used to illustrate economic growth. So the first thing that we need to do is to pin down what this term economic growth actually means. So the economy grows when it produces more goods and services than it did before. Another way of saying it is that when the economy's output has increased, economic growth has taken place. So when the economy produces more goods and services than it did before, you can say that economic growth has taken place. Economic growth is obviously important to economists because the more that a country can produce, the more it will be able to consume. Economists measure a country's output through a statistic called gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the total value of all goods and services produced within an economy over the last 12 months. So you can measure the economic growth rate by calculating the annual percentage increase in real, that means inflation adjusted, GDP. So if real GDP has increased by 3.4%, that would equate to economic growth of the same magnitude. So one more time, the annual percentage increase in real GDP is the economy's economic growth rate. That's how we measure economic growth, by calculating the annual percentage increase in real GDP. So it shows that the economy is producing more goods and services than it did before. So economists distinguish between two different types of economic growth. Those types are short-run and long-run economic growth. So that's what we're going to get into next, the different types of economic growth and how we can illustrate both types using PPF analysis. Short-run economic growth describes a situation where an economy's output has increased because the economy is now making full use of its existing capacity. So let's take an economy and we'll assume that this economy can produce either goods or services. Now, at the moment, there must be unemployment within this economy because we're currently operating at point A, which is inside the PPF. Remember, to operate on the edge of the PPF, all factors of production must be fully utilised. So therefore, if we're operating at point A, which is to the left of the PPF, i.e. inside the frontier, that implies that we're not fully utilising all of our factors of production. And the most likely factor of production that we're underutilising is labour. So we're operating at point A. Let's see what we're able to produce at that point. So in terms of services, at point A, we're producing S1, and in terms of goods, G1. So you would say that our total GDP, total money output of our economy, would be G1 plus S1. Okay, now if we can reduce unemployment, if we can maybe do better than that, eliminate it completely, and achieve this situation called full employment, where everybody of working age who is available to work, wants to work, actively seeking work, they're all in employment, will be able to operate at point B on the edge of the frontier. At point B, we're fully utilising all of our factors of production, so we're now able to produce S2 services rather than S1, and we're also able to produce more goods at the same time. So we're able to produce G2 goods rather than G1. So our GDP at point A was G1 plus S1. It's now going to be G2 plus S2. So G2 plus S2 is higher than G1 plus S1. So we've definitely got economic growth. And also you would say that this is short-run growth because the economy's output has increased because we're now making fuller use of our existing capacity. The capacity of the economy hasn't increased. The PPF hasn't shifted out to the right. Nothing's changed there. What has changed is that by moving from point A to point B, we're now making much fuller use or complete use of the economy's existing capacity. And because the increase in GDP stemmed from making fuller use of the economy's existing capacity, you could say that that is short-run growth. So a quick recap. So maybe due to low levels of aggregate demand, the economy is currently suffering from unemployment and is forced to operate at point A, which is inside the PPF. Keynesians would actually say that unemployment's a consequence of low levels of spending. Their logic is that if spending's not very high, firms won't sell many goods and services. So because they're not selling many goods and services, they won't really want to produce too many goods and services because they would be left with unsold stock. So when spending's low, firms tend to cut production. If firms cut production, they don't need as many factors of production, including labour. And that's why you tend to get unemployment associated with low levels of consumer spending. And for that matter, low levels of spending throughout the economy in general. In other words, low levels of aggregate demand, total spending. So the equilibrium level of GDP at point A, as we say, it's equal to S1 plus G1. To create short-run economic growth, the government and the central bank will need to inject spending into the economy to get this aggregate demand thing up, to get total spending in the economy up. Firms will sell more. To sell more, they'll need to produce more. To produce more, they'll need extra labour, so they'll take workers on. Unemployment will gradually start falling and the economy will be migrating away from point A towards point B. So one thing that the government could do to increase spending is cut taxes. If taxes fall, households will be able to purchase more goods and services from their wages. As we say, to produce the extra goods, firms will have to take on extra workers and unemployment will start to drop. Now, if we can get this full employment situation achieved, that's a situation where everyone of working age who's looking for work, available for work, is in work, will be able to operate on the edge of the PPF at point B. GDP at B is equal to S2 plus G2. So as a result of the government's decision to boost aggregate demand, the country's GDP has risen from S1 plus G1 to S2 plus G2. So as I say there, it's a prima facie case of short-run growth. The economy's productive capacity, it hasn't risen. The PPF curve has not moved to the right, but output's increased. Output's increased because the economy is now making fuller use of its existing capacity. And that's happened as a consequence of the government injecting spending into the economy that's reduced unemployment. So just as a little interlude there, what I was just talking about a moment ago is an example of Keynesian economics. Keynesians believe that the economy's output level is determined by the level of aggregate demand. Aggregate demand being the total level of spending within an economy. So unemployment, so the Keynesians say, is caused by a lack of aggregate demand. If spending's not very high, firms won't sell very much. Because they're not selling very much, they'll cut production in order to prevent the build-up of unsold stock. If firms are cutting production, the derived demand for labour will drop, firms will make redundancies, and you'll get unemployment. And what you'll get is the economy producing at a point somewhere inside the PPF. Obviously, that's no good. Unemployment is going to cost the government money in benefits. We're going to lose output, which means that we also lose consumption and utility. So what Keynesians recommend is that the government should find a way of injecting aggregate demand into the economy. And that is normally through fiscal policy, which is the government's tax and spending plans for the year ahead. So you can inject aggregate demand into the economy through fiscal policy in two ways. You can either cut taxes or you can increase government spending, or maybe a combination of the two. Other economic theories are available. So let's turn our attention now to the other type of economic growth. This other type of economic growth we call long-run economic growth. So the definition for this is long-run economic growth describes a situation where a country's GDP has increased because there's been an increase in the productive capacity of the economy. So this type of economic growth will shift the PPF to the right, indicating that the productive capacity of the economy is higher than what it used to be. So let's look at how we could use production possibility frontier analysis to illustrate long-run economic growth. So again, we've got an economy that can produce either goods or services. At the moment, we've got no unemployment at all. We're operating at point A on the edge of PPF1. So at this point, because it's on the edge of the PPF, all factors of production, including labour, are fully utilised. So this means that short-run economic growth isn't possible because we're already fully utilising the economy's existing capacity. At point A, the nation's GDP is G1 plus S1. So if we want to increase economic growth in this situation, we need to increase the economy's productive capacity. And that will involve shifting the PPF to the right from PPF1 to PPF2. If we can shift to PPF2, a point such as B becomes attainable. At B, we can produce S2 services and G2 goods. So the new level of GDP will be G2 plus S2, which is higher than G1 plus S1. So the difference is economic growth, and that economic growth is long-run growth, and it's long-run growth because it's happened as a consequence of an increase in the productive capacity of the economy. So long-run growth is characterized by a shift to the right of the PPF curve. So as a quick recap, the economy was operating at point A on the edge of the PPF, producing G1 plus S1. Short-run economic growth wasn't possible because the economy was already making full use of its existing capacity. All those of working age who were fit, available, and actively seeking work were already in work. In this situation, long-run economic growth is needed to raise national output. Long-run economic growth happens when GDP rises because the economy's productive capacity has increased. On a PPF diagram, long-run economic growth is shown by a rightward shift of the PPF, in this case from PPF1 to PPF2. The increase in the productive capacity of the economy enables the economy to produce S2 plus G2 at point B on the edge of PPF2. The increase in national output from S1 plus G1 to S2 plus G2 is an example of long-run growth. GDP's risen because the productive capacity of the economy has increased. So, what can cause long-run economic growth? What can cause the productive capacity of the economy to increase? Another way of looking at it is, well, what can cause the PPF to shift to the right? Now, in general, there are two options. There are two possible causes of long-run economic growth. There are two possible reasons why an economy's capacity might increase. The first one is that you might obtain additional factors of production. So you might have more land, labour, capital, some more entrepreneurs maybe. So more quantity of factors of production. Well, the other one is quality. So you might be able to produce more from the same quantity of factors of production by improving the quality of your labour, capital or land. So basically, in essence then, long-run growth is about improving either the quantity of your factors of production or the quality of them. So let's look at what a country can do to obtain more quantity. What can it do to obtain more factors of production? So what about more labour? Well, an obvious kind of historical example would be slavery, but let's look at some other examples of techniques that countries have used to increase the amount of labour at their disposal. Obviously, the more labour a country has, the bigger its economy's productive capacity. So one policy that a government could use is just to import people. So that's called immigration. So Germany's birth rate's not been particularly high, so you could look at Angela Merkel's decision to encourage immigration into the European Union. Was it based on altruism, or was she just trying to increase the European Union's stock of labour? The more labour that Europe has, the more that the European economy will be able to produce. You could also encourage the people that you already have to produce more new people. So that's what the government in Hungary have done. So they've tried to incentivize families to have more children by tweaking the tax and benefit system to favour those that are willing to have children over those that choose not to have kids. So immigration isn't the only way to increase the quantity of labour at a country's disposal. I guess another thing that you could just do is just make the workers that you've currently got work longer, so you could increase the age of retirement. That would give you more labour hours and increase the productive capacity of the economy that way. So when I first started teaching, it was fairly common for teachers to retire at 50. These days, there's people I know who are still teaching at 70. So it's just become more normal for people to have longer working lives. Ceteris paribus, that will increase the quantity of labour at a country's disposal. Encouraging people to have more kids, yes, that will increase labour, but there'll be a time lag there, of about 18 or 21 years before the new people that you've created are able to enter the workforce, the time lag being attributable to education. So land is another factor of production. We could try to create long-run growth by trying to acquire extra land. So the Dutch were famous for this, trying to reclaim land from the sea using dikes, the land being put to good use to produce crops. Countries can also use their armed forces to seize other people's land, so that's what Napoleon and Hitler both had in common. They both sought to increase the productive capacity of their economies by seizing Russian land. Barack Obama managed to assist American economic growth by deposing Colonel Gaddafi in Libya. So much of Libya's valuable oil resources are now in the hands of US multinationals. Allegedly, this was all done for humanitarian reasons, but you can make your own mind up for that. My question to you would be, would the US and the European Union have been so interested in the plight of the Libyan people had the main export of Libya been broccoli rather than light sweet crude oil? As I say, you can make your own mind up. Capital's a factor of production, as you know, so what can countries do to obtain extra capital? The only way that you can obtain extra capital is to invest. Investment being defined as capital expenditure undertaken by firms. So, for example, in a car factory, if the company that runs the factory purchases new computer-aided manufacturing robots, that's an example of investment, and investment will increase the capital stock of the economy. More capital means an enlarged productive capacity. Investment is a good thing. There's a battle here again about the causes of investment, where the money comes from. Keynesians just assume that firms that want to borrow in order to purchase capital can just do so. It's easy. The banks can create money out of nothing and lend it into existence. The Austrian school, so this is Friedrich von Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, they work in a world of sound money. So what they say is that in order for an economy to enhance its stock of capital, households must save. They must postpone consumption, because when households save, they place their loanable funds in banks, and those loanable funds are then used to finance loans to firms that want to borrow to purchase capital. So Austrians argue that to enhance the capital stock of the economy, it will be necessary to sacrifice consumption in the short run. Keynesians sort of swerve that issue completely. They don't think that there's any trade-off between consumption and investment. In fact, they think that there's a positive relationship between consumption and investment. That if there's more consumption, there'll be more investment too, because if people are consuming more, firms will need to increase output, and to increase output, they might need to automate. But as I say, the big issue is, where are firms going to get the money from? In a world where nobody saved, the bank vaults would be empty. So a firm might want to borrow from a bank to purchase capital, but what if there are no loanable funds there to borrow because households have spent all of their income? So I think from my subjective point of view, the Austrian school has it in this case, because they actually understand that loanable funds are needed to finance investment, and to create those loanable funds, households will have to temporarily sacrifice consumption. So just an interlude there about this kind of ongoing battle between Keynes and Hayek and the Austrian school. Entrepreneurs are the fourth factor of production. So theoretically, we could increase the productive capacity of the economy by creating more entrepreneurs. So how could we do that? How could we encourage more young people to consider setting up their own business, becoming a risk taker? Well, some of it would be cultural, I guess, but also maybe the government could help by creating an educational system that encouraged people to value free market capitalism, rather than the smearing entrepreneurs as being evil or bad people, anything associated with private businesses somehow dirty. So I would say that in the UK, this is a massive problem. Our education system doesn't celebrate entrepreneurs. It sort of demonizes them. Another problem is arguably an overly generous welfare state. So maybe if we didn't have that welfare state, there might be stronger incentives for people to set up their own business. As the saying goes, necessity is the mother of all invention. So if you took away welfare benefits, then people would still have to eat. So where would they get the money from if there weren't welfare benefits? Well, they might have to set up their own business. So we've talked about what a country can do to improve the quantity of its factors of production. What we'll look at now is things that a country could do to improve the quality of its factors of production and create long-run economic growth in that way. In a nutshell, this involves improving productivity. Productivity is output per unit of input. The most common type of productivity that people refer to is the productivity of labour, which is output per worker. If each worker can produce more, the economy in total will be able to produce more output, and that will shift the PPF to the right, creating long-run growth. So what could we do to increase the productivity of labour? Well, obviously the first thing that we can do is make sure that we have a functioning education system. So this isn't just about academic subjects and making sure that subjects that are more useful for the economy are promoted at the expense of subjects that are less economically useful. It's also about inculcating cultural values within society that are economically beneficial. So trying to encourage responsibility, reliability, and just hard work. If the education system needs to develop those qualities in young people, and education needs to be valued. That's the best way to increase the productivity of labour, by investing heavily in people. Health can also affect the productivity of labour. So, for example, in the UK, we've got a problem with diabetes caused by bad diet, inactivity. All of this means that people miss time off work. People taking days off sick means that output per worker is lower than what it should be. So if we can improve the nation's health, we'll be able to create an increase in productivity. So the same workforce will be able to produce more in total, and so the PPF will shift outwards to the right, and that will cause long-run economic growth. So it's quite interesting at the moment about UK government official dietary advice. You could argue that there's been some government failure here. For years and years and years, the government told us that natural products such as milk, cream, cheese were all really bad for us, and we should cut them out and instead switch to chemical artificial products like margarine sold in plastic pots, and switch to low-fat versions that were packed full of sugar. So this guy in the picture there is a famous cardiologist called Aseem Malhotra, and what he's been trying to do is to change the UK government's so-called healthy eating advice to try to improve the nation's health. And if he can do it, there will definitely be economic benefits. And one of those economic benefits will be a healthier workforce that's more productive. More power to him. Slow and overcrowded infrastructure can also reduce productivity. So in the UK, there's not been much investment in transport infrastructure since Victorian times, especially the trains. They're overcrowded, they're slow. That means longer commutes, more stressful commutes. This will obviously reduce output per worker per hour. People are stressed out by the time they come to work. It's not good for the economy. It's going to make long-run economic growth less possible. Meanwhile, in countries like Japan and Germany, infrastructure investments have been highly successful. Commutes are relatively short and unstressful, and all of this helps to increase output per worker. Meanwhile, as I say, in Britain, our productivity is very, very low. We have what's called a productivity puzzle. It's not really a puzzle at all. There are some pretty understandable reasons for it, which we've just talked about. Incentives can also affect productivity. So again, we go back to the tax and benefit system. If the tax and benefit system favours people working part-time, that's effectively what tax credits do. Rather than working full-time, you can work part-time, have your income topped up with tax credits. The difference between full-time working and part-time working topped up with tax credits isn't that great. So surprise, surprise, people respond rationally to the incentives sent out through the tax and benefit system by working part-time. So that obviously reduces the output produced by each UK worker because they're only working part-time rather than working full-time. So another thing that we could arguably do in Britain to improve productivity is to scale back welfare benefits, cut taxes, and make work pay. That might encourage people to work longer hours and work more intensively because they get to keep more of the income that they've earned helping other people. So we're coming towards the end of this another video. What conclusions can we draw? The first one is that short-run economic growth arises when the economy's output increases because the economy is now making fuller use of its existing capacity. And on a PPF diagram, you'll show that by a movement from a point inside the frontier to a point either on or closer to the edge of the frontier. In contrast, long-run economic growth is a situation where the nation's output's increased because the economy's productive capacity has risen. What's the difference? Well, basically, long-run economic growth shifts the PPF to the right, unlike short-run economic growth, which doesn't. So short-run growth is all about moving from a point inside the frontier to a point on it or closer to the edge of the frontier. Long-run growth is all about shifting the PPF to the right. It's caused by an increase in the productive capacity of the economy, and there's only two ways of doing that, which is to either improve the quantity or quality of the country's factor endowment. So, in the words of Jim Morrison, this is the end, my friend. Another economics video done and dusted. Hope you found it useful.